Welcome to the fourth session of our four-part webinar series on the CSA Z1011.1, which is a standard on work disability management in paramedic service organizations. I'm Emil Tompa. I'm one of your co-hosts for today. This session is being hosted by the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, or CRWDP, which is transitioning into the Inclusive Design for Employment Access, or IDEAS, initiative, a social innovation laboratory that's focused on building employer capacity for equity, diversity, inclusion, and access. IDEA has been recently funded by the New Frontiers in Research Transformation Stream for a period of 6 years. Next slide, please. Yeah. Just to give a bit of a land acknowledgement, where the National Office of the IDEA Social Innovation Laboratory is situated has for thousands of years been the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to conduct our work on it. Please note that this acknowledgement is relevant for the Toronto area. However, since we are coming from different regions, we would suggest thinking of the communities in your respective locations as well. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to acknowledge the key source of funding for the development of this standard, which is from the Defence Research and Development Canada Centre for Security Science. But the views expressed here and in the standard do not necessarily reflect those of the funder. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the outline for our session today. There are multiple speakers who will comment and present an overview of the standard development process. Our key highlight for this session is an excellent stakeholder panel who are also people from the technical committee that developed the standard. We have some questions that we have prepared for them that they'll speak to in a later part of this webinar session. So do feel free also to ask questions. There's a couple of different opportunities where you can ask questions, and you can use the Q&A function, which would be one of the options at the bottom of your screen. So to pose your questions, and we will have Lena, who will be monitoring the questions, as well as we have a couple of other people behind the scenes who will help facilitate some of the Q&A to support the process. Next slide, please. Okay, so myself and Amin Yazdani are the leads of the webinar series. Amin Yazdani, unfortunately, is unable to join us today because he has a sick child and he himself is sick, so he had to give his regrets for this session. The webinar series, as I mentioned, is being co-hosted by CRWDP, now IDEAS, and as well the Canadian Institute for Safety, Wellness, and Performance, which is at Conestoga College. I, along with Minyas Danny, have been the co-host for these 4 sessions. These sessions, as I mentioned earlier, are being recorded. They are available also on the websites of our respective institutions. And on the very last slide, or close to the end, I have details of where you can access the previous versions of the webinars that we've had over the last year. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to pass it on to Pierre Poirier to give a little bit of an opening comments about the standard. Take it away, Pierre.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Emil, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I think you'll see a little bit later on that over the last several years, the paramedic community has developed a very positive relationship with the CSA group. And over that period of time, we've developed a dozen or so standards, and I think a little bit later on, Lena will be going through that. The development of standards is really kind of, and this is my spiel, is akin to what the fire community has done with the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, is where you get all the interested parties who don't necessarily all speak the same thought, but all have a shared interest. And that's been the relationship with the CSA, where they bring everyone from the profession to the paramedic to the administrators, and even to the providers, the service providers, be it an ambulance service provider or another provider within whatever area of expertise we're dealing with. So the relationship has been very positive as it's developed. Also, there's been several granting agencies that have been engaged as well. And Emil and Amin have been good partners in this process. So as we talk about this standard and its development, this is really the maturation of the paramedic and the paramedic profession as we start to do better and actually as a community start to, have a broader kind of breadth of what we are invested in. And a particular note in this standard is we're very much concerned with the people who actually perform the work. And it isn't just a paramedic, it's people within the service that perform the work and taking care of those individuals. And, I'm very proud to have participated in this and had a role with some very talented individuals who brought this standard together. And I think it's, something that we'd say yesterday hasn't come to fruition yet. The standard is there, but the application is going to take time. And that's the purpose of a webinar today, is start to get the message out in a very positive way that we can all do better. And even within the service that I work in, we have to take a look at what we've developed in terms of the standard and find ways to start to apply the good knowledge that is within this document. So very much thank you, Emil, for the chance to speak today. Thank you for everyone who's participated in this, and I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Lena, I'll pass it on to you now.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I'm Lena Lopez, the project manager of this particular standard that we're presenting on today. And speaking of apologies, I'm just getting over a seasonal cold, so my voice sounds a little different. Next slide, please. I'm going to be covering the developmental process of a standard and how it gets formed and how you can possibly, if interested, get involved in the standard. So I'll speak to what we do at CSA and how do we get to that process of publishing a standard. I'll speak to a couple of standards and what goes into it. So next slide. So at CSA Group, we are a global non-governmental organization, and there's two parts to our organization. There is the one side, which is the commercial, very well known for the testing, inspection, certification. Often you can see our mark, the CSA mark, on plumbing equipment. Here in Canada, I would say it's the hockey helmets, that quite popular and quite visible. And over on the other side, we have the not-for-profit area, and that's where the standards do get developed. We work with a group of volunteers, which are technical members, and there's also a research arm to this and education involved as well. Next slide. So thank you. So right now there is the development process or cycle. It consists around 7 different stages. And so I just wanted to highlight that here, and I can see my picture, but what I wanted to draw your attention to is that this is the cycle that any standard and any sector goes through. And this particular standard, Z1011.1, has gone through ways for the public to get involved. So should you not be a technical member that's been around the table or in this virtual space to help develop the standard, you can get involved during the public review process. So looking around stage 4. So for each standard we sent out, that's considered our inquiry stage. So the standard that is in draft out for public consultation, we'll gather feedback, bring it back to the technical committee, review what was being asked to be proposed, and then we'll work from there. Going through the cycle, the other time the standard goes out to be published. And that's where we also want to hear, although the standard has been published, like this one in particular, we still want to hear from you. So should you be reviewing the standard, have any questions, or would like to propose a change, an update, you can see how something can be enhanced. We do want to hear from you and request that you send us that information. And then that piece will go back into the committee for further conversation, and we can consider it as a possible amendment, or it can be just a part for the next edition, hopefully. So that is the entire cycle. And at the point of request for change, each standard holds for approximately 5 years. So that's where we'll do a review of the landscape, see what has changed, take into consideration any comments that have come in from a committee, and we'll repeat that cycle often once again. Next slide. So just various ways that you can get engaged with CSA. So you're welcome to participate on a technical committee. And even though a standard has published, it does hold for 5 years. So we're looking to maintain that it's continuously, it stays valid. So you're welcome to join the committee at that point, or you can send in a comment, request for change. The other piece to get involved is that CSA has a community online. So the website's there, community.csagroup.org. You can create a profile, it is complimentary, and you can be involved in the conversation or just watch what conversations are taking place. Next slide. So here on your screen, if you're able to see it, it is a cover of the standard, and what you find there is the National Standards of Canada stamp. So this has gone through an accreditation process with Standards Council of Canada, and it has been signed off that it is deemed as a national standard of Canada. On this, we also acknowledge the individuals that were involved, not necessarily the individuals, rather the partners that were involved in developing the standard. Next slide. In regards to the paramedic community, to what Pierre was just mentioning, CSA has been working in this with the sector for quite some time, not a very long time, but quite a bit of standards have been developed. The first standard that's listed on this page is it's highlighted in an amber color, I'll say. That's the one that we're speaking to. The other standards are ones that have been published in the past, within the past year. I'm trying to remember what year we're in. It feels like things have happened so quickly. There is one standard right now that is in the works, and it might be the one that Pierre just jumped off this call to participate. So it's the National Occupation Standards of Paramedics. Should you not be on that technical committee, just keep in mind you are welcome to review that document when it goes out to public review. There is a separate website that you can just be alerted when that comes out, and you can just review what has been drafted at that point. Next slide. So here there's 7 standards that have that pertain to the paramedic community, and they're found on the CSA website. If you are all interested in any of them and unable to find them, please feel free to reach out to me. Next slide. On this particular page mentioned about the technical committee members and the composition. So each standard has its own composition. For this standard, the Z1011.1, it has, looking here at the description, there's 5 different stakeholders that have been involved to provide input and experts in the area. And at the time, see, it's not, a couple of areas have not reached max, so there's still an possibility to join the committee as a voting member. All members that do come into a committee are reviewed by the executive committee, and it is at their discretion of who comes into to join the membership. Next slide. So with the standard, and just to get you comfortable in going through a standard, it has a very simple framework. What we'd like to think, it has a preference. Each standard, once you review it, has a preference. It will tell you who has been involved in that standard, and it will go through clause 0 into clause 4. And these are the same with any particular standard. So clause 0 will provide you with the introduction of the standard, how we kind of got here. Why the reason that we're moving forward with providing some requirements and guidance for the community of individuals who the standard is pertaining to, provide a scope, what is included and what is excluded out of the standard, as well as reference publication. 3 is the definitions that pertain specifically to the standard. Hopefully they're not definitions that are found in the dictionary, so they will be specific once again to the standard. And from clause 4 onwards are the requirements. So at CSA, we have particular language. So we're looking at a shall statement, which are the requirements, the should, which are your recommendations, and your may, what is permitted. Following our annexes in the standard, and here in this particular annex, I think there might be 3 annexes, and they are guidance for the readers, for the user of the standard. Next slide. And speaking to the clause, so clause 1 will always be the scope. This particular standard, as you can see, it has the inclusions exclusions. And this committee, the technical committee members, were very cautious in looking at this and very specific that they wanted to address operational stress injuries. That is what is found within the standard, and it is very explicit here in the inclusion. Next slide. And here are just additional resources. So now this is the fourth part of the four-part series of the webinars. They are found on the CSA website as well. And as well, the standard is available for free view access on the CSA site, both in English and French. And next slide. So we're often asked is the standard mandatory? Do we have to comply to it? So all standards are volunteer until they are referenced in legislation. So this standard is complementary. It is complementary through view access, but it is also voluntary. Next slide. And then in regards to questions, so here on Zoom, there is a little speech bubble, so feel free to submit your questions there. Or if you think of something afterwards, you're welcome to send me an email. My email is on the website, which is lina.lopez@csa.org, and that's LINA. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Lena. Well, anyways, let's move on then, and then maybe we can feel that the questions that come specifically for this part that you were speaking to, as we get into the questions for the panel as well. So maybe we can deal with them all at once. And so everybody, just feel free to put your questions into the chat, and when we get a moment, we'll speak to them. In the next few slides, I want to give a brief overview of management systems. And this standard is a management system. It's meant to be part of how the organization manages its operations. This standard, along with many of the CSA standards and organizations' best practices, take a very much of a systems level approach to addressing change at the organizational level. The traditional approach that has been taken for work disability management in particular has often been reactive, hence the reason for us preparing this standard and a previous one that we did that's more broadly scoped for all organizations on disability management. But historically, what organizations have done is they've assigned the role of work disability manager to a particular person. Sometimes someone in HR, or larger organizations might have a separate disability management unit with a person designated as the disability manager. And some organizations even farm out the disability management function, having an outside consultant service and deal with return to work issues or absence management type issues. So those are very much reactive approaches. You deal with problems as they arise, whereas the systems approach is really meant to be proactive and considering all the roles and responsibilities within the organization that help support the particular activity at issue, in this case, work disability management type issues. It really considers the inputs, process, outputs, and feedback required to have a very robust management system, in this case, with a work disability management system. And it's really framed around evaluation and improvement on a continual basis. So it has a cyclical process to it, where you're looking to see where there's room for improvement, where there are gaps, and plan a cycle to address some of those issues. And then once you fill those gaps, you evaluate, make sure you've met all your targets, and then you continue the process and in subsequent round to always be thinking about how can we do better in the area of work disability management. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to give a little bit more background about management systems, it's meant to be a formalized framework of policies, processes, procedures used to meet the organizational objectives, in this case, work disability management. And that's why we describe these things as management systems. They're usually documented, the policies and procedures are documented. It's tested, step-by-step methods really aimed at smooth functioning in the area, in this case of work disability management. Audits, as I mentioned, measurement evaluation are a vital part of the management systems approach because it is really based on a continual improvement philosophy. And ideally, organizations will have frameworks in place to address all of their core aspects of their activities. So work disability management is just one facet of a management system. They'll obviously have management systems frameworks around various other activities within the organization. And so this this particular standard for work disability management in paramedic service organizations is meant to dovetail with other CSA and ISO work disability management system standards and best practice guidance. Now, the systems approach to work disability management really ensures that there's clarity, consistency, and integration with all the organizational activities. As I mentioned, it's meant to be proactive to address health needs of workers before they become disabling. Next slide, please. So just pop over one more if you click on it again. Okay, so as I mentioned, you start off with policies. They really play a fundamental role in setting very clear directions for the organizations to follow. It really meant to be documented as well, so that there's clarity about what those policies are about and are available for everybody to understand and respect and adhere to. Next. Okay, and then we think about the management structures that need to be in place to deliver those policies. You have to make sure there are roles and responsibilities assigned for the different aspects of managing the particular system, so that everybody knows what their role is and can turn to the policies to better understand how they can support the implementation of those policies through the particular role that they play within the structure. Next slide, please. So planning is really critical, particularly when you're going through a cycle looking to improve the system. So planning is done on a systematic approach, and you do this on a regular basis to make sure you're implementing the policies in its most robust fashion possible. Next slide. Emphasis is really given, as I mentioned, to measurement of performance against targets. So if you want to set some targets to think about, here's what we want to achieve, and we strive to achieve them over a particular cycle. And you look for areas where there's room for improvement, and then set targets to achieve those improvements. And then the next point, click again, is to review and learn from those experiences through measurement and evaluation, seeing how well you've achieved those targets, doing any kind of fix-ups you need to achieve those targets if you haven't been quite successful in achieving them, thinking always about that continual improvement process before going through another round of the continual improvement process, where you'd start up again at the top end, thinking about what incremental policies do we need to develop, sort of thing. So that's sort of the framework of the cycle, often described as plan, do, check, act. Next slide, please. And so, oops, go back. Just okay. So I'm going to get into details of the standard, but this management systems approach that I mentioned is really embedded in the chapters of the standard. We saw an overview of the chapter structure that Lena provided. I'll give a little bit more details over the next few slides. So next slide, please. Okay, so here we have it again. So we start off with an introduction, the scope, the references, the definitions, and then Clause 4 onward is the body of the Plan, Do, Check, Act framework, and core modules of activity that are the essence of the standard, the best practice guidance, and then several annexes are also provided that support some of the core activities. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, the mention of the Plan, Do, Check, Act. So you start off with determining what you will do and how you will go about doing it. So that's the development of those policies. The do part is implementing that plan. The check is assessing performance relative to the plan, and then the act is to take appropriate action and to correct and improve to make sure you reach those targets for that particular cycle. Once you reach them, you start again another cycle eventually, and to think about other areas you want to work on to improve in your management system. Next slide. So we've seen this slide. This particular management system is designed specifically for paramedic service organizations. It's really focused on operational stress injuries and other mental health conditions that could be due to work-related exposures, but also to non-work-related exposures. Now, the standard overall is focused on all kinds of disability, whether it's physical or mental health conditions, whether it's work-related, non-work-related. And so it's really meant to broadly be scoped around the needs of a worker when their health is compromised. And it really starts off with a preventive approach to ensure that whenever possible, health issue is not disabling for the worker. So that primary prevention to sort of dovetails into work disability management and work disability prevention. Though we are focusing and drilling down quite extensively on operational stress and mental health issues in this particular standard. Next slide. Okay, so according to clause 1, we have 5 key stakeholders that play critical roles in the management of work disability in paramedic service organizations. There's top management, there's frontline managers and supervisors, internal subject matter experts, disability management specialists, healthcare professionals, which will often be external to the organization, and then workers and their representatives, unions in the paramedic community. So we detail in clause 4.1.1 the specific obligations and roles of these 5 key stakeholders. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have clause 5, 6, and 7, which is that plan, do, check, act cycle. So clause 5 is planning, where you review internal and external practices to kind of get a sense of where the organization is at currently. You think about where the gaps are, so you do the gap analysis, try to prioritize what gaps are most critical to fill based on the feedback you get from your constituents within the organization. Establish objectives and targets. So you want to get a sense of, okay, what can we accomplish in this cycle? Look at benchmarks possibly to help you get a sense of what organizations are doing externally, or what your successes were in the past, to think about where is there room for improvement. And then you want to have that commitment to continual improvement. In clause 6, then you're going to that implementation stage. You want a competent person's tasked with this function to help implement that plan that you've put together for this cycle. As the organizational change occurs, as you're reaching those targets, the system is reviewed to make sure there's, we're reaching those targets, or if there's room for adjustment, you want to do those adjustments to reach those targets, and make sure that there's preventive protective measures in place as best as possible to serve the needs of the paramedic service organization's constituents. In clause 7, we're looking at performance monitoring, evaluation, and focusing on that continual improvement process. So measurement and evaluation are absolutely critical in this process. The standard is meant to be scalable to different sizes of paramedic service organizations and whatever kind of framework they have in place currently for work disability management systems. It's not, obviously, this process is meant to be customizable and contextualized for the particular needs of an organization. It's not a one-size-fits-all philosophy. So much of what's described in this guidance document around managing work disability in paramedic service organizations, it is reasonably high level, and one needs to think, if you're one of the actors within the system implementing it within your organization, what are the kinds of key things that you want to adopt in your organization to meet the needs of your constituents? That takes you obviously back to the planning stages, but you want to think about what's realistic given our context and what are our priority needs. So qualitative and quantitative methods are used, are promoted to assess progress being made by the organization. So you don't want to just think about numbers, but also qualitative, getting feedback from the people affected by the management system, get a sense of what's working well, what's not working well, what needs improvement. And then these act as key checkpoints to make sure that you're reaching your targets. Next slide, please. Okay. A couple of annexes, or much four of them that are part of this standard. Annex A is about wellness checks during a medical leave. So it gives some guidance on how to do that in a good way when somebody's absent for health reasons, making sure you can check in with them to be supportive of their needs, to help support whatever kind of issues they're grappling with, and possibly the places where the paramedic service organization can help support some of those needs during that absence. Annex B is about mental health literacy, and providing training and education to all of the key people within the organization to make sure everybody's up to speed and understanding mental health and how to be supportive of people's mental health needs. Annex C is about work-focused exposure programs. This is about transitioning back to work and how you can ensure that that's done in a smooth way. You don't want to re-injure the person and have their trauma be further magnified during that return to work. So you want to do it in staged approach, and this gives some guidance around how to do that in a good way. Then Annex D just gives some bibliographical references for additional material that might support your understanding of how to implement this standard within your organization. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to turn to the panel discussion, and Lena will be chairing that discussion. So Lena, if you want to join in now.
Thank you. Yes. Next slide. Perfect. So I'm going to start with the first question. The first question that I'm going to ask the panels: how can the new CSA Z1011.1 help organizations better manage work disability related to the occupational stress injury?
Hi, my name is Tanya Mouros. I'm a director at Public Services Health and Safety Association. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be on the technical committee and to be part of the panel today. When I think about work disability management, especially in a 24/7, 365, infinitely variable workplace, it's challenging. It's challenging to do. I think what this standard can help paramedic service organizations with is looking towards that prevention lens and managing, rather than somebody is ill or injured and they're off work and fingers crossed they'll maybe come back. When it's medically appropriate, how do we have conversations about staying at work? How do we engage with an individual when they're off for whatever period of time is medically appropriate for them, and they still feel connected to the workplace, so they don't feel abandoned? And then when we're ready and it's appropriate to have conversations around that return to work piece, how do we ensure that's successful? Like, we want to set the individual up for success. We want to set the organization up for success. We want to set the partner of the returning worker up for success. So what does that look like? The challenge is, we know the exposures are going to happen. Stop taking 911 calls is not an option. We know that with the current situation we find ourselves in as a healthcare system, there are some significant challenges. And I see this as a way to improve the employee experience during a challenging time.
On to the second question is: how can top management ensure that the successful implementation of a systematic approach to work disability management?
I think what's really important, and what has come up in the conversations I've had with leaders in PSP organizations across the province, is that we really need to sit and ask ourselves and reflect on what's in place right now. Where is our organization today? Where do we want to go? And how are we going to get there? This is an undertaking. When we're thinking about the implementation of a management system, this is not a 6-month project. This is a multi-year project. So what kind of commitment are we going to put in place in terms of resources, the time, the people, the money to do the implementation and make sure that it's successful and sustainable? What does it look like for senior leaders in the organization to demonstrate commitment to the standard? And how do we meaningfully engage the right stakeholders so that the variety of perspectives are heard and that we've got buy-in from the different stakeholders so that the implementation can be successful and sustainable from a longer term perspective?
Thank you, Tanya. To the third question is here: can you speak to the importance of management, commitment, and leadership?
So without it, you're sunk. I don't think you'll get too far without, in terms of a long-term sustainable program. You're not going to get to a spot where a program is fully implemented and living and breathing without the commitment of the senior leaders in the organization. Thinking back to the things I said for the previous question, all the things that are needed in place to make this living and breathing require that commitment. They require action, time, money, vision, and strategy, as well as the in the weeds implementation. And that's not going to happen and not going to be long-term without the commitment of the senior leadership team at the organization.
Thank you, Tanya. Next slide. So I see that Bruce is on the line. Bruce, a couple of questions for you, quite similar. To start with the first one, how can the new standard, the Z1011, help organizations better manage work disability related to occupational stress injury?
Hi, and thanks, Lena, for the question. And similar to Tanya, I was honored and privileged to be part of the technical team and on the committee, and it was a very good learning experience for me and good input. So, and thank you for having me on the panel. In regards to the question, I think the most, well, not the most important, but one of the more key aspects that the standard gives is that we all speak the same language. Whether you're senior leadership, middle management, frontline paramedic or provider, to a labor organization, everybody is speaking the same language and with the same intent and same drive and same goal. And that's the early and safe return to work, and have the person become able to come back to work, whether it's in their pre-injury state or in some sort of return to work, modified return to work, but giving them the self-worth and getting them back into the workforce that they rightfully belong to. The standard gives that foundation, and how that is built upon and reinforced within the organization is key. So that's where I feel that the standard has the biggest bang for the buck on those disability management pieces.
Thank you. On to the second question, which is a two-part question. So the first part is, what is the role of internal disability management in the work disability management system? And how can this role best dovetail with external healthcare provider supports?
That is a very good question, and we're experiencing it locally right now. So our disability management wellness coordinator, caregiver, in with the HR department in conjunction with our service, is working with the frontline workers and making sure that their case is managed well, but learning with our insurance provider, and whether that's your WSIB, workplace safety insurance, or if it's an outside insurance provider for a non-occupational injury. So they understand the public safety personnel's role, responsibilities, and what their job is, because public safety personnel, whether it's police, fire, EMS, is much different than traditional jobs. And people don't understand that, clinicians don't understand that, and insurance companies don't understand that. So we're actually in the process right now of advocating with the insurance companies for them to understand, and the clinicians to understand what the job is, so that we can do our modified work programs, do our exposure training, and then they can understand exactly what our job entails and what restrictions could be. We get it a lot where we'll get a restriction that makes no sense to us, but makes perfect sense to a clinician. So how we advocate that so that we're all speaking the same language, and we always guide back to the standard of, let's make sure we're following these guidelines.
And Bruce, if you have the opportunity to speak with the healthcare professionals, anyone in particular, the next question leads to that. So how can healthcare professionals best work with paramedic service organizations to support them in their management of occupational stress injury?
So the big thing is real life experience. If you can find clinicians that understand and have worked with public service providers, police, fire, EMS, and understand their role and have lived that. We have a few clinicians, both locally and long distance, that their therapists or clinicians are either ex-PSP providers, or their family is in with the paramedic role, and they've lived it, grown up with it, and understand it. Again, for that piece. The other one is that we're bringing clinicians in, or at least offering them to become embedded with the service, so that maybe do a ride along or a few ride alongs to understand what we deal with day in and day out, so that they can understand how you became injured, and then how they can help with your recovery. For example, and I'm going to use a paramedic term, and I saw just from the participants, there might be a few out there. When we bring a patient in with a normal medical injury, maybe it's a fractured arm, we give the incident history and people can relate to that, or physicians can relate to those. But when it comes to occupational stress injuries, it's hard to relate to. So if they understand it, see it, feel it, and totally kind of live it, then the clinicians are more able to help us with that.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm going to go on to the next presenter. Hi, Megan. A couple of questions for you.
Hello.
Hi there. I'm just going to turn off my video because I'm getting that little message that I have low bandwidth. So I'm going to turn off my video. So the first question is for you. What are the key challenges facing paramedics in the area of occupational stress injury?
So I guess as a little bit of background, when I was thinking about these for the last week, I spent a lot of time talking. I coordinate the peer support team here. So I talked to the other peer support team members to hear sort of their feedback that they've been hearing from people. As well, my husband, he and I both started being medics at the same time, and he ended up off with an OSI, has now transitioned into government. So sort of between chats with people that I've had over the time, and listening and knowing his experience, I've sort of compiled the key issues that people have brought forward. So essentially the first one that came up was perceived or real stigma that still exists within the organization, and that can be at all levels. So people still feel like it's there, no matter how much we keep trying to sort of suppress that. It is still an issue that people come up against. Also a lack of education. So it's difficult for people to recognize that there's something wrong if they don't know what to watch for in themselves. And we can sort of slowly slide into that over time. So people just sort of adjust and think that it's kind of their normal. So we need to be able to recognize it in ourselves and others who are around us. Even once you do know that something's wrong, where people find it difficult to access the help and get the diagnosis to sort of get the whole thing started. And even once they have a diagnosis, people find it quite challenging still, just with the system the way it is, to be able to get the treatment and support that they need. So we're constantly trying to fix that and to make more resources available, but mental health care is challenging to access these days. There's a lot of need for it and not as many places as there should be. So I also found a lot of people who mentioned that, and I mean, we all know it. So being a paramedic is different than other jobs. I think people sort of internalize it and make it part of their core identity more than some other jobs may. So if you lose that, or if that part of your life is really painful, all of a sudden that I think makes it even more challenging. Not to mention the fact that with the hours and the way our job is and the way that you relate to other medics and your peers, more than maybe the general population, a lot of people have their entire support network is sort of tied up in other medics. And if all of a sudden they're out of work, they lose that, and it's more isolating than I think it would be if we had a little bit more varied support networks. But as a general rule, from the people I know, a lot of us just sort of, we're medics and we spend our time with other medics, and that's our support group. Another issue that a lot of people seem to express is that it feels like we're quite replaceable. Whether that's true or not, it feels to a lot of people that the organizations feel like we can just be sort of pushed aside and they can bring new ones in. So there's always schools pumping out new medics, and people do feel like there's not that much incentive to try to work with them to get them better and to get them back. And instead that they could just be sort of pushed aside for a new hire who might not have sort of the background issues that they do. And then return to work. So once you get to the point where you're ready to do return to work, it's a lot more complicated with an OSI than it is with a physical injury. So I've come back from some physical injuries, and it's quite easy to adapt. If I just can't lift something or I can't do CPR for a little bit, that's easy to still do a lot of stuff on that call. But with OSI, it could be anything that triggers it. It could be seeing people in uniform. It could be the trucks. It could be the tones. It could be any call. And I've found a lot of advanced care paramedics, so my ACP peers, A lot of their concerns are once you're not the third medic and you're the two, there's just two of you again, your partner's always going to be a lower level. And so all those serious calls, you can't even just be a second if you're just not feeling great on that one. Because of your level, you have to take over that. So that makes it even more challenging.
Thank you, Megan. With the second question is, how can the new standard help organizations better manage work disability related to OSI?
So I think organizations, they're trying their best, but I think that this is more complicated and we're seeing more of it maybe. So they're just not set up and they don't really know quite how to handle it. It's a little bit of a more sensitive issue and it's more multifaceted. It's harder to treat mental health stuff than it is physical stuff. So I think they also find it quite challenging and they're not quite sure. And I'm sure organizations have been trying all sorts of sort of improvised solutions with probably varying degrees of success or possibly even harm. So I think that having the standard there, it's a spot where we've compiled all the advice and the research and best practices, and they can sort of go through it. I think ideally, any organization would be able to put somebody specifically on this, and this would be their sort of area of expertise, and they would be able to usher it in and work with it and work through it and expand their knowledge and their training and sort of feed into that pile of research and experience that we're sort of building on. But yeah, I think it gives people the framework that they so desperately require instead of just trying to come up with their own solutions.
Thank you, Megan. Now, what advice would you give organizations to support their efforts in adopting the new CSA Z1011.1?
So I think that they should use this standard and the stuff that's included in it, because there's so many different points about how to support people and how to create a better workplace culture that's more supportive of it. So I think they really need to use it to sort of foster in that culture change that we require. We also, in the standard, it talks quite a lot about education, and it has a lot of education pieces. I think that's a very key part for any organization trying to support their medics. So they really do need to fund, oh, there's going to be a cat in front of the screen in a second. They need to really support ongoing education. So I know most organizations would have in services quite frequently, as well as maybe online courses, and it should be a part of that on a regular basis. People really do need to keep hearing it, and new staff need to hear it, and older staff need to hear it. We all just need a reminder of it all the time. So that we can identify things in ourselves and others and sort of help support our entire organization, because it can't just be management. It has to be everybody all the way through. We all have to be sort of on board with this. We also the resources need to be very accessible and very public, so that you always know right from the get-go, these are all the things you have available to you. This is how to do it. Maybe get people to sort of interact with it a little bit while they're healthy, so that when they're in crisis, all of a sudden it's just sort of second nature to know where to go and what to look for and what's available, as opposed to trying to figure it out at that point. And there would never be an excuse for a supervisor or HR or anybody not to know where to pass them quite easily and to help them through that whole process. So it should never be a difficult process. And every once in a while we run into sort of changes, and maybe our EAP changes something and then all of a sudden nobody can get in. And so we need to be right on top of that, and anything that changes needs to be put out to everybody so that they're really aware of how to access it. I know there's lots of good resources out there, but if people don't know about it, and if we don't know how often people are using it, so I think we should also be sort of tracking, respecting confidentiality for sure, but tracking how often each of these services are used, so that we know which ones are the easiest to access, and then getting feedback too. So if everybody's accessing EAP but it's not going well, they're not having a great experience, we need to know that and fix that. As well. So overall, basically, I think we need to have really strong peer support networks, because that's often where people turn first. And I think it's really good. I think most peer support networks across their teams across the country are getting flagged by dispatch when there's difficult calls, and management should be as well. So I think dispatchers really need to be trained in what to look for. So most people would have that list of bad calls, but I think stepping up and training them to know this one just sort of doesn't feel right, or it sounds really bad, maybe that's worth a check-in. If it turned out not to be so bad, that's okay. But at least we should be checking in with them, seeing how they are. Management should maybe be afterwards going through the call list, making sure nothing was missed that should have been passed along, so that people aren't on these bad calls and then feel like they were just sort of left and nobody checked in on them. I've had a lot of people say that they would like to have changes put in place, and I know it's difficult right now because we're everybody's short-staffed, but more often than not lately, it feels like people are having these bad calls. They're just barely getting their trucks cleaned. They've not taken any time for themselves. They haven't been able to go to the washroom, sort of gather their thoughts, and then they're back out on the streets. So I think trying to really encourage that we need to give people that time that they need just to decompress after, chat to their partner, see how they're doing before they're immediately pushed back out on the street as well. And that's pretty well it, I think.
Thank you. That's a lot. That's a good amount of information and insight. So next slide. Michael.
Hi, good morning. Apparently I didn't get a headshot in time, but that's okay.
I see you on video, so it's great to see you. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Start with the first one. What are the key challenges facing paramedics in the area of occupational stress injury?
Well, I think Megan covered off the big three, which is access and attitude, I call it, as well as support. But looking at it from a different lens, so I work in a very large service, so I think the lens is going to be different depending on how the size of your service. So in our service, the challenges that we've been facing, and we have about 650 paramedics in the system, is in fact access is the number one. And how have we resolved this? So recently we put a tender out, an RFP, for organizations that would be interested in providing us rapid access to mental health resources. Much to our surprise, one of the major healthcare providers in the area submitted a no-cost RFP, or a no-cost proposal, and their proposal was driven primarily by access to our benefit plan. So that is a possibility as well, depending on the size of the organization. Another key challenge facing paramedics is in my workplace is workplace violence. So we have determined that up to 80% of our staff have experienced workplace violence. Being on the receiving end of workplace violence is a known risk for PTSD. So this is a big challenge we're facing now, is trying to address workplace violence issues so they don't negatively impact the staff through occupational stress injuries, and be supportive. I find that another challenge facing frontline paramedics is a B4. So bona fide occupational requirements have really not been established in law in Canada for this type of work. So there's quite a bit of back and forth over what really is a core requirement for a paramedic and what it is actually just a wish list. All right. And finally, I find the challenges are going to be, again, dependent on the size of the organization and the structure of the organization. So in the traditional paramedic service model, where staff report to and from a station and relieve other staff on a regular basis, there is a social support network that exists there that by default. When you get into the divisional model system, which is where I work, where they have built a large division where you report to and pick up a truck and leave for the day, you've actually lost all of that social support. This is what we've discovered was the biggest problem in our organization, is is we took away the social interaction by moving to the divisional model, and now we're trying to figure out a way to recreate it. So those are, from my perspective, the biggest challenges that I found facing frontline paramedics at this time.
Thank you, Michael. Now, just looking at the other challenge we have here, we're around 2 more minutes. So I'm going to go quickly with the next question. How can the new CSA standard help organizations better manage work disability related to occupational stress injury?
Fortunately for these, my answers were shorter. It establishes a common framework for workplace disability management, and in particular OSI management within paramedic organizations, and allows them to move forward within a documented framework with confidence that it provides an evidence-based approach to disability management. So that's kind of my answer for that one.
Thank you. And I think the third question is a very important one. What advice would you give to organizations to support their efforts in adopting the new CSA Z1011.1?
Resource, engage, research, and document. So provide the resources sufficiently to make it happen. Research what your state of organizational status is at the moment in comparison to the standard. Engage the organization as a whole, because it's really a team effort. Everybody has to be on board for this for it to work. And finally, track. So data is your friend. Data will allow you to go to council and justify expenses associated with implementing additional programs. So those are the big four, I think.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to all the panelists, and over to you, Emil.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that was a great panel session. Some great insights about how to do this well, and how to use that standard to its most effective approach to its implementing it in different paramedic service organizations. So in terms of resources, you have view access in English and in French at the link that's provided here. We don't have any upcoming webinars. This is the last in our 4-part series, but the recordings of them are available. This one will be available shortly, but the previous ones are available on our websites, which are in the subsequent slide. So the webinars we've had, actually the dates here in the last one is not correct. And then there's a communities of practice page that's in development as well. Next slide. So here is a place where you can find both the standard itself, but the webinars, which are available on the YouTube channel for CRWDP and Conestoga College, and the links are provided at the bottom of each of those the page prints from YouTube. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to thank the audience for attending, but I also really want to thank our panelists, Tanya Morose, Megan Colville-Daly, Bruce Croder, and Michael Spears for an excellent panel session, and also Pierre Poirier to providing that introduction, and then for Lena for giving us a great background about the CSA standards development process, and also for moderating our panel session. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.